Shadow People, a DPT trip report by Morning Glory Seed. October 2001, 30 milligrams of DPT consumed. I carefully weighed out 100 milligrams of N,N-dipropyltryptamine hydrochloride and dissolved it in 2 millimeters of distilled water. It was very difficult to get the DPT to dissolve, and I found it necessary to add a little heat to get it into the solution. Then I filtered the liquid through a 0.02 micron filter for sterility. After transferring the solution to a sealed glass ampoule for storage, I measured out 0.6 milliliters of this solution, which of course was equivalent to 30 milligrams of DPT hydrochloride. This was my first experience with intramuscularly administered DPT, and I rightfully decided to start with what I viewed as a low dose. Never one to enjoy snorting odd-smelling powders, I was anxious to try DPT via a new method of administration. Though I was a bit nervous about the injection process, I was looking very forward to comparing the effects of IMing this material to insufflating it. Those I've spoken with who have taken it both ways swear by the IM method. Plus, DPT was always administered by IM injection when it was researched as a psychotherapeutic tool in the 70s, so it seems to be a well-explored manner of administration. Using my trusty automatic injecting device, I administered the 30 milligrams into my upper thigh. There was no burn and the injection went smoothly. No immediate effects were noted. I decided to spend the onset of the experiment outside, so I packed a bowl of marijuana and brought one balloon of nitrous oxide with me and made my way outdoors. For an evening in October in the Midwest, it was unusually warm. There was not a cloud in the sky and also very little humidity. After 10 minutes there was still nothing happening, so I decided to smoke some pot, figuring it would help kick in the effects. 2 or 3 hits was all it took. After the marijuana, I noted the distinct DPT vibration in my body. The night sky was suddenly filled with colours, and there seemed to be life and activity stirring about in the trees. I was amazed at the relative smoothness of IM's DPT. The previous experiments with insufflated DPT were very forceful and demanding in nature. In some ways this was actually gentle, or at least during the onset of the experience it was. Around 15 minutes into the experiment, the effects seemed well developed and I decided to take my balloon of nitrous oxide. As usual, the effects were overwhelming. I can only describe the place I travelled to as serene. There was complete silence as the universe and I became one. My ego ceased to exist and the I simply became one with everything. True bliss and universal harmony. This lasted around 3 minutes, though I had no perception of time as this event occurred. It was on my return that things got a little weird. As soon as I became aware of my body again, I noted a strangeness in the air. I couldn't quite place my finger on what it was that was so weird, but there was a certain foreboding feeling in the air, almost as though I was no longer alone. I decided to gather my things and make my way back inside. The walk down to my room was a little difficult. My motor control was a little off as well, and I seemed to sway as I walked. The visuals had also grown quite intense, and it was actually a little difficult to see clearly over the intense trails and colours that filled my perceptual field in the dim light I was walking through. I put on Donovan's Please Don't Bend, which is a very beautiful acoustic ballad that has a biting edge to it. Very intense song. What happened next is beyond my ability to describe rationally. It is definitely the sort of event that is completely unbelievable unless you experience it firsthand. As soon as I sat down on my couch, there was this creature, entity or being there with me. It sat directly behind me in the couch and started to massage my scalp. It was shaped in a humanoid fashion. I couldn't make out any specific features because I did not turn around and examine it. I was paralysed with fear and did not attempt to intervene or stop it from happening. I just sat there and let it do what it wanted to do. I'm not in a position to say any of this was a figment of my mind. Not only could I clearly detect the presence of someone or something there with me, but I could also feel these hands in my hair, and my hair was also visibly moving. There was certainly no wind or breeze in my bedroom moving my hair in the fashion it was. The entity event seemed to end as soon as it began. This occurrence was over by the time the song had ended. The experience of having my scalp rubbed by a presence I was not used to left me rather unnerved, and I spent the remainder of the trip attempting to put the pieces back together and figure out just what happened. For the next hour or so, I rode out the waves of fear and uncertainty that I was feeling, knowing the effects of the DPT would soon wane. Though I never reached a state of all-out panic, it was not a comfortable trip after this event. I did not expect to have an entity contact me from a mere 30 milligrams of DPT, and I suppose I was in a bit of shock from the whole thing. By the third hour, I was mostly down. It was only my body that was still buzzing. A few days later, I visited my local wise lady who was a Native American, and she seemed to know exactly what it was. "It's a shadow person," she said whilst laughing. "That's what they do, among other things. Massage the scalp. They mean you no harm." My friend was really convinced that that's what it was, and said my description of what happened fitted the bill completely. She has had 3 such encounters herself after deep meditation, and says many Native American legends speak of beings that she feels are what we have both encountered. She did not know exactly what shadow people were or where they came from, but did offer a few theories. The most reasonable of which I thought was that shadow people exist to comfort us. The touch they provide is their means of bringing soothing feelings, so I guess that is what it was, and with that, I am satisfied. That trip will have to go down in my books as one of the strangest events I have experienced. I have had entity contact from smoke DMT, but nothing like this. Not direct physical contact. I also believe that the DPT may have been a catalyst in this event, but it was not the cause. Though I cannot even begin to decipher the meaning of it all. Hopefully in the future this mystery will reveal itself to me, and I can bring real meaning to it.
My experience with the psychedelic DPT is not one I would want to remember. My boyfriend and I and one other friend took this horrible drug one night, and it led to disaster. My friend Ben and my boyfriend David were both intrigued by the drug and by the amazingly psychological and hallucinogenic trip it induced at small dosages when taken nasally. They decided to double their dose to 40 milligrams that night, despite my warnings. At first, everything seemed to be going well. I was feeling a bit different, but I was not actually tripping yet because I had only taken 25 milligrams. Ben was overwhelmed by his hallucinations. He smiled like a maniac, his eyes open wide as if he were seeing unimaginable things. Suddenly, he stood up and a horrible look crept on his face. He dropped his pants right there and began to cry that he had to cut his ding-dong off. We were able to calm him down, but although it was amusing, I had an unsettling feeling about myself as well as David and Ben. Meanwhile, the DPT I had snorted had begun to take effect. I was seeing visuals left and right. Most of them were color distortions and morphing. It was so intense, but I seemed to be handling it well, so I wasn't worried. David, on the other hand, had been thrown off guard when Ben started to freak out. He was begging us to take him to the hospital. He complained about his heart, and although it was beating abnormally fast, I kept assuring him he would be okay. Everything seemed to calm down after that. I found my trip to be intensely psychological, which I don't much like, with much less visuals than I had expected. I left the room for 2 seconds, and when I heard the commotion, I ran back in to see Ben, seizuring and spazzing, out on the floor with 3 guys holding him down. His eyes were still wide open, but his expression was that of pure terror, as if he were seeing some really awful hallucinations. Within seconds, his eyes rolled back into the back of his head, and he began to froth at the mouth as he continued to seizure violently. Trying to remain calm, I kept my composure as we dialed 911 and held Ben down so he would not hit his head. In a drug-induced panic, I left and returned to my college dorm, hysterically crying the whole way. It is hard to put into words what I was feeling then. It was like 20 emotions all at once, with severe undertones of terror. The world moved and swirled around me, and I could not see straight. Soon, the police and EMTs tracked me down and insisted I go to the hospital. My heart rate was dangerously high, and I was in a state of panic shock. I was taken to a different hospital, but from what I heard the EMTs saying, David and Ben were in a lot of serious danger. After I returned home from the hospital, I talked to David, who told me what happened. Ben was insane and convulsing in the ambulance all the way to the hospital, rambling about crazy things and screaming at things that weren't there. I think I would have been fine if I had been in the right environment, but as David and I found out, DPT and panic do not mix. Either of us could have had a heart attack because both of us have in the past, but if Ben hadn't lost it, we might not be in as much trouble as we are now.
The Path of Good Wishes, a DPT freebase report by Merple. Well, I woke up today to the sound of my phone ringing. Answering it half asleep, I hear my friend B telling me in a shaky voice that someone had just blown up the World Trade Center in New York. My first reaction was, oh my god, what have these anti-WTO nuts done now? Still on the phone, I stumbled to my computer and pulled up the CNN.com website. All it had was a headline saying, "Attack on America," a picture of the Twin Towers exploding, and a few lines of text saying that planes had crashed into the towers as well as the Pentagon. I talked to B on the phone for a few minutes, then turned on my TV. Genius that I am, I decided to try to go see how close to the Pentagon I could get. I got in touch with people from my work and explained where I'd be going before coming into the office, and I was told repeatedly how insane or idiotic I was. I grabbed my camera and headed out onto the road. A life lived in fear is no life at all. I live in a town about in the Virginia suburbs of DC, and with no traffic, I'm about a 15-minute drive from the Pentagon. I made my way to Route 236, heading into Alexandria. I planned to try to get to Route 1, which runs right by the Pentagon, and go as far towards the Pentagon as I could without getting stopped, and try to get some photos at least. The highway into DC, I-395, was blockaded by police at every exit, but I was hopeful that the back roads might still be open. I didn't get far into Alexandria before traffic came to a standstill. I hung a U-turn and turned onto Van Dorn Street heading north. I first went to Landmark Hall Shopping Centre, which has a 3-level parking garage looking over I-395 towards the Pentagon. The top level was blocked off, but I parked my car and walked up to the top. Looking north, I saw a large plume of blackish grey smoke rising up from where the Pentagon was, several miles away. Helicopters circled in the smoke, and as I stood taking pictures, a military medical chopper marked with red crosses flew low over my head towards the smoke. I called my friends and family to make sure everyone was okay, and to let them know where I was and what I was doing, getting quite a few "Are you crazy?" reactions, predictably. I noticed that Van Dorn Street seemed clear as far as I could see, so I got back in my car and headed north until it began to curve away to the east. I turned onto Seminary Road and head to a high-rise apartment complex called Southern Towers, and tried going up to find a good high elevation view, but unfortunately there were no windows in the hallways and the door to the roof was locked. I next tried to get into a high-rise Hilton but was turned away by security guards, saying only guests were allowed in. I gave up and went into work. At work, almost everybody had gone home. I stayed for about 2 hours following the news and talking to my friend B via email. I went home and turned on the TV and heard that roads into DC had been opened up. So I grabbed my camera and headed back onto the road. I got on the Beltway and then onto the I-395 into DC. I-395 runs right by the Pentagon. As I came up over the hill before the Pentagon, I saw a gigantic plume of black smoke. Helicopters flew overhead. Police cars were everywhere and exit ramps to the Pentagon were closed. As I drove into the smoke cloud, I was overwhelmed by a disgusting aroma of burning paper with overtones of burning electronics. The smell was powerful and stomach-churning, and the realization of all the deaths that contributed to that smell made it something that I will not soon forget. I snapped a few pictures while driving by as well. I then drove into DC itself and found a roadblock before reaching the mall. I turned right towards the Capitol building. The town was virtually empty. All buildings were closed, almost no cars on the road. I parked near the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum and walked towards the mall. The roads directly bordering the mall were closed. Dozens of police cars and trucks were parked on the grass in front of the Capitol. There were no people around other than police, TV news trucks, and, quite surreally, a handful of joggers. I snapped a few pictures and walked back to my car. While driving out of the city, I noticed that the flags ringing the Washington Monument were all at half-mast, and the usual crowds of tourists were nowhere in sight. I headed back down I-395 past the Pentagon. The southbound lanes are closer to it, so I got a much better view this time round. The southern side of the building was a gaping hole, dark smoke billowing out and blackening the sky over much of Arlington. People were stopping on the roadside to take pictures and being chased away by police. I slowed down and snapped photos while driving. I drove down a little further and did a U-turn, turning back onto the I-395 towards DC. As I headed into DC the second time, I saw a swarm of helicopters flying over town, circling the vicinity of the White House. A minute or two later, the announcer on NPR radio said that the president had just arrived back in DC, so I suppose I was seeing his helicopter and a group of decoys. I went into DC as far as the roadblock before the mall and turned around for another pass by the Pentagon. I headed home after this, quite disturbed. I decided it was important to conduct a psychedelic ritual. I hadn't used any psychedelics other than MDMA type things for a good 9 to 10 months, and this certainly was not how I wanted to jump back into things, but what must be done must be done. I got out my ritual Owayo cloth and spread it out on the floor in front of a table covered in plants and with a life-size sandstone Buddha head sculpture. I lit a coal and covered it with copal resin incense. I got out my copy of the Bardo Thodol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and then I filled a pipe with about 15 milligrams of DPT freebase. I read from The Path of Good Wishes, which protects from fear in the Bardo, as I lit my pipe and inhaled the sacramental smoke. Let it come that the gloom of ignorance is dispelled. I soon found myself being flooded with terrifying images. I felt the terror of being in the World Trade Center as the planes hit and as the buildings collapsed. I felt the fear of the passengers on the hijacked planes. As the pentagon rose up to smack me from the sky, I saw a frightened young girl, perhaps 5 years old. She was screaming as her brown teddy bear with a bow tie flew forward with the inertia of the crash, as flames blasted up around us all. The flood of horrifying images became nearly unbearable, until I remembered why I was here. I continued reading. When the roarings of savage beasts are uttered, let it be that they are transformed into the 6 syllables, Om Mani Padme Hum. When pursued by snow, rain, wind and darkness, let it be that one sees with the celestial eyes of bright wisdom. I tried to send forth images of comfort and guidance to those who had died. I remembered the terror of death from my roughest ayahuasca experience, the confusion, the fear, and focused with all my being on trying to send good thoughts to the dead. I'm not a believer in the afterlife per se, but I do believe in the connection of all things and the illusory nature of time and space. Perhaps in some way, even many hours after the planes crashed, I contributed to helping reduce the fear of the people who lost their lives today. Knowing that around the world many other people were also sending such good thoughts, perhaps we did give some comfort across time. Perhaps we merely helped ourselves deal with the shock. In any case, it was a goodness. I next found myself being flooded by images of flashing police lights and felt the fear of the world. I was quite afraid for all of us who remain in this world. This is truly a time when cool heads must prevail to keep things from getting out of hand. Fear makes people do the stupidest of things. Fear creates doors for the Hitlers and Stalins of the world. All day I had been thinking of various police state scenarios which could arise from fearful overreaction to the day's attacks. Visions of martial law and war flickered through my mind, the colours of flashing police lights. I focused all my remaining energy to send out thoughts of calmness, wisdom, peace and reason to the leaders and populace of the world, and even to the people who carried out these crimes. After many long and hard minutes, I collapsed, exhausted, but with the feeling that all would turn out okay. It's never too late to send good thoughts out to the dead and to the living, and I strongly urge all reading this to perform whatever ritual seems appropriate, whether aided by entheogenic sacraments or not. Now is the time to fill our hearts with love and joy, difficult though that may be, rather than to allow ourselves to succumb to the hate and anger which creates such tragedies in the first place.
After having tripped on DPT at least 10 times, I thought that I had mastered the chemical. I was completely wrong. At about 12 p.m., I decided that I would insufflate 150 milligrams of DPT and go on a walk up the road to the dollar store. Shortly after leaving home, I vomited profusely due to the unsettling taste of the chemical's drip. Within 5 minutes, I was experiencing intense level 6 geometry. I began to freak out, thinking that there was no way I could go inside the dollar store like this. I continued walking, but it did not feel like I was moving at all. It felt as if I was walking in place while the world was zooming past me. As things became increasingly more intense, my trip took on a sinister and very unpleasant vibe. The visuals were so intense that I no longer knew where I was. The bodily sensations and visual impairment were just completely overwhelming. I had an extremely disconcerting sense of dysphoria. I felt as if I were in a cartoon-like nightmare. Even though I am very experienced with this chemical, I had formed a delusion that my mind was completely broken and I had gone insane. I thought the trip would never end. It felt like I had been tripping for hours, even though it was barely 15 minutes. At this point, I began to really start spazzing out. I would run back and forth and up and down the road, forgetting where I was and where I was going. I was completely lost, and I kept telling myself how much of an idiot I was for thinking I could handle this. I completely accepted that my mind was broken, that I would never be the same again. At this point, I started to form very unsettling scenarios and plots. I thought that I had been running around town tweaking for hours, and that everyone was in their yard pointing at me and laughing. I could literally hear voices yelling, "Look at him, he's gone crazy." I felt as if I had made some big mistake, and everyone knew what was going on. In reality, I don't think anyone was around. I ended up sitting on a bridge overlooking a river. I thought that life as I knew it was over. I thought about how my family would react, knowing that I had gone insane. They had warned me several times to stop taking psychedelic drugs, or I would one day end up in a mental hospital. I did not want to be suffering like this for all eternity in a mental hospital, so I came to the conclusion that I must die. At first, I was upset about this. I was literally in tears. I thought about everything that would happen once I died. I felt sorry for all of the people who would be affected and the people who would get in trouble for supplying me with this impure DPT that had so severely and indefinitely ruined my mind. I thought about my family and how much they would miss me. I even imagined my funeral. But I did not care. I was intent to end this pain and suffering. I thought about all of the ways that I could die. Perhaps drown myself in the river? Jump in front of someone's car? But then I realized that I may not be spiritually prepared for death. What if the trip continued into the afterlife? Would I be suffering like this forever and ever? I decided that I had to say goodbye to my mother. I ran home and told her that I had taken a drug called dipropyltryptamine and that I had gone insane forever. She had no clue what I was talking about and was very concerned because I had lost one of my sandals, I had a busted bloody lip, and I was covered in vomit and mud. I begged my mom to kill me and put me out of my misery before I got into the system and would have to suffer forever. She called 911 and told the paramedics that I was suffering from a drug overdose. They rushed me into the emergency room as if I was dying, which did not make my trip go any better. They said that my heart rate was 4 times what it should be, and my blood pressure was sky high. Thankfully, my trip came to an end shortly after arriving at the hospital. The doctors had no clue what to do since they have never heard of DPT. They contacted the Poison Control Center and then made me stay on IV fluids for over 5 hours. I also had to do a psychological evaluation before being able to leave. This was an extremely humbling experience, and I have learned that I must show proper respect for a chemical this powerful. I had no business going in public on such a high dose, let alone by myself. I am very lucky that I did not commit suicide, even when I had accepted that it was the only option. I have tripped hundreds of times over the past few years and never experienced anything this profound.